14, Hawk's Nest Tunnel Disaster. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is Poison Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you for listening. So, did you guys listen to the bonus episode on Cryptids of Appalachia? I hope you liked it. Also, hope you liked the one on Trans Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I thought both of those are pretty fun to do. Of course, I enjoy doing all of these, so I hope you enjoy them as much as I enjoy doing them. Side note, my two dogs are in the office with me as I'm recording this. They're both sleeping. But if you hear any background noises, it's probably going to be them. Hopefully you won't. I had a schedule of episodes made up that I was going to cover in November and December, but I've changed my mind a bit, so who knows what I'll cover. A couple weeks ago, I did an episode on haunted tunnels of Appalachia. But this week's episode is about a real occurrence in a tunnel in Appalachia. It's about the builders of the Hawk's Nest Tunnel. And yes, this one is about West Virginia, but this is an important episode, I think. I'm pretty political in my real life, but I'll try my very best not to bring politics into any episode. But I will probably bring a lot of my thoughts about rich corporations and how soulless they are into many episodes, and this is definitely one of them. The main villain in this story is Union Carbide. Many of you have probably heard of Union Carbide before. They were behind the 1984 Bhopal disaster in India, which killed around 16 to 20,000 people and left another 40,000 people permanently disabled. It's considered the world's worst industrial disaster. But this isn't about that. This is about our country's worst industrial disaster. At least for the time. I'm not sure if anything's been worse since then. Hopefully not. Founded in 1917 as the Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation from a merger with the National Carbon Company, the company's researchers developed an economical way to make ethylene for natural gas liquids such as ethane and propane, giving birth to the modern petrochemical industry. The Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation was formed on November 1st, 1917. From the merger from the company Union Carbide, founded in 1898. The National Carbon Company, founded in 1886. Lind Air Products Company, a maker of liquid oxygen at Buffalo, confiscated from some German company under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. And the Presto Life Company, manufacturer of calcium carbide in Indianapolis. So they all combined together to become the Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation. In 1920, the company set up chemical divisions which manufactured ethylene glycol for use as an automotive antifreeze. The company continued to acquire related chemical producers, including the Bakelite Corporation in 1939. The company changed its name to Union Carbide Corporation in 1957 and was often referred to as Carbide. It operated Oak Ridge National Laboratory from 1947 to 1984. During the Cold War, the company was active in the field of rocket propulsion and development for aerospace and guided missile applications, particularly in the field of chemicals and plastics, solid rocket motors, and storable fuels. So they just kind of did a little bit of everything. But their main thing to begin with, of course, was chemicals. And this is kind of what this story's about. After the Bhopal disaster, Union Carbide was the subject of repeated takeover attempts. In order to pay off its debt, Carbide sold many of its familiar brands, such as Glad trash bags and Ever-Ready batteries. Dow Chemical announced the purchase of Carbide in 1999 for $8.89 billion in stock. The deal was consummated in 2001 and valued at $11.6 billion. Union Carbide, though, was not the only villain here. A contracting company named Reinhardt and Dennis are also culpable to this story. This story starts in the 1920s. Union Carbide wanted to build a smelting plant in Alloy, West Virginia, and they wanted to build a hydroelectric power plant to power the new facility. They already had a dam there, but they couldn't get enough power from the dam itself, so they wanted to put a tunnel in to create enough energy to power the plant, which in turn would power the smelting plant. So they wanted to up the speed of the water so it could create electricity, basically. Their plan was to create a tunnel at Hawk's Nest Peak on the New River near Gauley Bridge, West Virginia. The tunnel would divert the water to the dam, which would then run the power plant. The tunnel was about 3 miles long, and it would drop 162 feet to give the water more power to turn the turbines at the end and to create the power. They started bidding on the project, and Reinhardt and Dennis out of Charlottesville, Virginia, was the lowest bidder of the project. But they had always had quality work, so it was definitely a good plan for Union Carbide to hire them. It was planned and designed by Union Carbide engineers. Reinhardt and Dennis were given the contract. This was a state of the art. I'm sorry. This was the start of the Depression. I don't know what I'm saying here. This was the start of the Depression, and everyone needed jobs. African American men came from the South desperate for jobs. They had heard about the coal mines and that they were good, steady work. So Reinhardt and Dennis hired about 3,000 to 4,000 of these men coming up from the South for the project. Most of them were the African American men, as well as some local people. Migrant African American workers played an important role in the early formation of the industrial and coal industries in the Mountain State. Jim Crow laws, extreme poverty, and a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan pushed young black men north in search of a life the South couldn't offer, a search that led many of them to the heart of the Mountain State to this job. They thought they were going to have good jobs to secure a better life for them and their families. They thought they were heading to the promised land. They unfortunately were very wrong. They began construction March 30th, 1930, but shortly after construction began, they found that the rock had a very high silica content. Silica is found in sand and sandstone. Gauley Mountain, where the tunnel was built, was 99% sandstone. It was a valuable commodity in 1930. Drilling through sandstone kicks up silica dust. One worker later said the dust was so thick he could practically chew it. Union Carbide could use the silica at their plant, so this was an unexpected effect of the digging of the tunnel for them. And it made them, an even more successful project for them. Gauley Mountain was made up primarily of sandstone, 90 to 97% of which was comprised of silica, the common term for silicon dioxide, which is a primary component for manufacturing glass and a valuable material for industrial smelting. The Hawks Nest Tunnel was technically a drilling operation, not a mining operation, but the company was permitted to extract and use any silica produced by the byproduct of their tunneling. When Union Carbide learned of the existence of silica and such purity in the Gauley Mountain, they expanded the size of the tunnel from its planned 36 feet to 42 feet in diameter to expedite the extraction of the valuable material. To save time and meet their deadline and extract as much silica as possible, Reinhardt and Dennis employed primarily dry drilling in the tunnel. Typically, safety protocols would call for wet drilling in such an environment, in which water is applied to the drilling surface to suppress clouds of particulate matter. However, wet drilling is slower and more expensive than dry drilling. Facing a tight deadline and substantial cash incentives, management opted for the quicker and more efficient method. Of course. Why wouldn't they? Who cares about the workers? The dry drills kicked up dust and a lot of it. Workers inside the tunnel reported being unable to see more than 10 feet in front of them and when the drills operated. Men exited the tunnels caked head to toe in dust. Silica can be filtered out pretty easily by face masks, but God forbid that they spend any money to help the workers, so they decided not to provide them with face masks. Also, they could have used the water to keep the dust down, but that would cut into their profits too, so they weren't going to do that. So pretty much nothing to help the workers breathing in the silica. Breathing in very small crystalline silica particles causes multiple diseases, including silicosis, which every time I type this, I think scoliosis. So if I say scoliosis, it's silicosis. I'm going to try not to. But silicosis is an uncurable lung disease that leads to disability and death. Respirable crystalline silica also causes lung cancer, COPD, and kidney disease. Exposure to crystalline silica is related to the development of autoimmune disorders and cardiovascular impairment. The operational diseases are life-altering and debilitating disorders that annually affect thousands of workers across the United States. Within weeks of starting this work, men began to feel ill with what the doctors called tunnelitis. Many workers began complaining of hacking and coughing and searing chest pains. The average worker stayed on the job 15 to 16 weeks because of the illness. Tunnelitis, referred to what we now know to be silicosis, is a disease that affects people exposed to airborne particles of silica. It's essentially a cloud of small fragments of glass. So basically, it's getting into the lungs, tearing them up, creating scar tissue, and then it affects their ability to breathe. With sufficient exposure over a sufficient period of time, this scar tissue begins to impede breathing to the point of death if it continues. And silicosis was widely known in 1930s. It's not like they had no idea about it. The disease had been extensively documented since at least the 18th century under a variety of names such as Potter's rot and Quarryman's disease. Safety measures to mitigate the risk of inhaling silica, of the wearing of masks, proper ventilation, use of wet drilling techniques, were likewise widely known. Union Carbide and their contractors at Reinhardt and Dennis knew the risks of silicosis and how to prevent it. When the workers began to die, no one in management was surprised. The company's paymaster is reported to have said, "I knew they was going to kill them within 5 years, but I didn't know it was going to kill them so quickly." But with jobs hard to find, reports that workers were dying failed to deter others. Men who died or fell sick and refused to go to work in the tunnel were easily replaced. Since most of the workers were not local, having been attracted from all over the southern United States by the possibility of employment, Reinhardt and Dennis built company camps. The camps were strictly segregated by race. Although the shanties in each camp were approximately the same size, 100 to 150 square feet, divided into 2 rooms, those occupied by the white workers were wired with electricity and housed 4 men. Those occupied by the African American workers, the majority of the workforce, were not wired with electricity, and they housed as many as 12 men. I read somewhere that it was as many as 16, so anyways, it was way too many. No matter the occupancy of the room, and board for the shacks ran approximately $6 a week, about half a labor's salary. Eventually, less workers were coming in, so the workers at Hawk's Nest were essentially a captive labor force, housed in overcrowded and unfurnished shacks, with the black workers paid not in currency, but in company scrip, which could only be cashed for a fee at the company commissary. Typically, each shift of miners drilled 320 holes, to which they packed 6 to 8 pounds of 100 pounds of dynamite. For the hour it took to detonate the charges, the men waded 300 to 400 feet up the tunnel, after which they were forced, often at gunpoint, and even before the dust settled, to return to clear the debris. They resisted returning because of the danger presented by silica dust. Neither Union Carbide nor Reinhardt and Dennis ever measured dust levels in the tunnel because most of the drilling was dry, as I mentioned earlier. Water was not used to suppress dust, nor was water or even ventilation used to suppress dust from explosions. This led to dust in the tunnel so thick that one could not identify anybody he met when the man was only a few feet away from him. As shifts end, dust concealed the complexion of miners' faces as well as the color of their clothes, and dust marked their tracks for hundreds of feet as they returned to the camps. As the workers began getting sick, some would be too ill to work. Reinhardt and Dennis routinely used violence against the black, though not the white workers, of course. A worker later recalled, and this is the language of the time, if a colored man was sick and really couldn't go to work in the morning, he had to hide out before the shack rouster came around. That fellow had 2 pistols and a blackjack to force men to go to work. The shack rouster, employed by Reinhardt and Dennis, had been deputized by the Fayette County Sheriff Department. At least one of the white foremen routinely carried a baseball bat to assist him in overseeing the black workers, and a white engineer testified to the use of violence to force African Americans to do the most dangerous work. He said, "I've heard quite a few times that they used pick handles or drill sted and knocked them in the head with it." As the workers got ill with what the company doctors had called tunnelitis, the doctors began diagnosing workers with pneumonia and tuberculosis. They were told tunnelitis was just a temporary condition caused by rock dust. They would give patients what they called little black devils, which were just tablets of baking soda coated with sugar. They also used racism to explain the illness, saying that black people were unusually susceptible to lung diseases. And then the local doctors didn't even know what they were dealing with. So if they didn't go to the company doctors and they went to the local doctors, they were just clueless. they had young, healthy people breaking down in a very short period of time, and there really wasn't a lot of precedent for that. They would become sick, profoundly short of breath, have severe weight loss, basically being able to move and function and exercise themselves. Because of the lack of knowledge of the local doctors and the willful misdiagnosing of the company's doctors, many of those that died had their deaths attributed to other things. So Union Carbide would claim that few of them died of silicosis. Each and every day I worked in the tunnel, I helped carry off 10 to 14 men who was overcome by the dust, a Hawks Nest worker recalled in a 1936 newsreel. Photos taken during the construction show ghastly images of workers shrouded in clouds of dust. According to the Union Carbide documents, 80% of the workers became ill, died, or walked off the job after 6 months. Union Carbide responded to the rock's high silica content by requiring all new Kanawha employees, which were the power plant employees, who were mainly engineers overseeing the project by Union Carbide, to wear respirators and receive warnings about the dangers of silica dust. But they didn't care about the common laborers, on the other hand. They received nothing, no respirators, no warnings, and they probably didn't even know about the risks because that's not the kind of job that they knew. They were coming up from the South, and they probably assumed that this was a better job. Union Carbide also provided ventilation through a pipe, but as it got full of rock and debris, they never cleared it. And according to the workers, the ventilation system was never turned on unless visitors came to visit. Because the Hawks Nest Tunnel was licensed as a civil engineering project, even the most modest forms of safety were not applied. They did not fall under the Department of Mines and had little to no oversight, which is why workers labored in confined spaces with poor ventilation, a lack of dust control, and limited use of personal breathing protection. I actually read that they weren't even given any breaks. They weren't allowed to stop what they were doing. They're supposed to have 30-minute breaks every so often to clear the air, but they didn't. They wouldn't let them do that. After reports of the death of black workers reached Robert Lambie, director of the new West Virginia Department of Mines, Lambie inspected the tunnel and wrote a letter to New Kanawha, warning of the hazards of silicosis and ordering that respirators be given to the laborers. His orders were ignored. Prior to the 1970s, respirator standards were under the purview of the U.S. Bureau of Mines. An example of an early respirator standard, Type A, established in 1926, was intended to protect against mechanical generated dust produced in mines. These standards were intended to obviate minor deaths, noted to have reached 3,000 by 1907. However, prior to the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster, these standards were merely advisory, as the United States Bureau of Mines had no enforcement power at the time. After the disaster, an explicit approval program was established in 1934, along with the introduction of combination type A, B, C respirator ratings, corresponding to dust, fumes, mist, respectively, with type D blocking all three. There was a nickname at the time for Gauley Bridge, the town of the living dead, says local writer Catherine Venable Moore, because there were so many sick workers, and also because they had this kind of ghostly presence when they were coming out of the tunnel, being covered in this white silica dust. They had no showers, so they brought everything back with them to their homes. They couldn't escape it. Even the local workers were bringing it to the homes, and people supposedly were getting sick there too, like their family members. To prevent public alarm or resentment against associated companies, Reinhardt and Dennis prohibited laborers from speaking to either the press or law officials. Those who spoke out would get fired. And Union Carbide more firmly exerted its formidable influence over editorial policies in local newspapers. So nobody could talk about it. The newspapers couldn't even talk about it. So nobody really knew what was going on. Really, until it was too late. The death toll grew too high to ignore, and nearly a year after work began on the tunnel, the Fayette Journal finally noted the great deal of comments about the town regarding the unusually large number of deaths among colored laborers at the tunnel of works of New Kanawha Power Company. The deaths total about 37 in the past 2 weeks. People commented on the paper's reluctance to confront the disaster at Hawks Nest. A reader might wonder what height a local death toll must reach to merit mention in the newspapers of a rural town, they said. According to Union Carbide documents, 80% of the workers became ill, died, or walked off the job after 6 months. I think I said that earlier. Nearly 3,000 workers labored in shifts of 10 to 15 hours. The tunnel was projected to be completed in 4 years, but it wrapped up in 18 months. More than 60% of the workforce that worked longer than 2 months in the tunnel were dead within 7 years of silicosis. More than 60% that worked more than 2 months were dead of silicosis in 7 years. And that's just crazy to me. While hundreds of local white men worked in the tunnel alongside black migrant workers, conditions were initially made worse for more than 2,000 black men. African Americans were assigned the dirtiest and deadliest work. They not only received lower wages on their white counterparts, but many testifying before Congress in 1936 said the company denied them the 30-minute breaks in clean air, which I mentioned earlier. When the workers started dying, only 10% of the bodies of the black workers were shipped back to where they came from. Most were buried, and I say buried in quotation marks because it was a ridiculous farce. According to death certificates, black workers were often buried in unmarked graves. In some cases, there was no attempt to notify the victims' families. They were buried in the county. This, of course, was the era of segregation, so black people could not be buried in white cemeteries. Many were often buried in old slave cemeteries or in unmarked graves. The company would pay undertakers to take care of them, and usually they were just buried in mass graves. There's a rumor that some were buried under the rocks by the river, but that one's unsubstantiated. I couldn't really find much about that, but I wouldn't be surprised. I just hate that they were all just so disposable. It's so sad. And I'll go into this a little bit more in a bit. Construction ended in 1931. On August 6, 1931, they broke through some of the shafts, and on September 19, 1931, they broke through the other side. So at this point, the tunnel was dug all the way through. They just had to finish stuff up. They finished construction completely in December of 1931. Like I said, it was way ahead of schedule. 2% of the workers that started out in the project were there when it finished. Just 2% of the workers for an 18-month project. It's just crazy. For a year or two, very little of the public outside of the area that where the tunnel was built knew about anything about the illness or deaths of the workers. But in 1934, workers and their families began filing lawsuits. There were estimated to be more than 500 lawsuits in total. Many were settled out of court, though. The compensation was based on race, with a black worker only receiving $30 in some of those. Several employees went together for a lawsuit, more than 160 workers together, and it went to court. The lawsuit was for $4 million in damages for the group. They only ended up getting $130,000, and the lawyers took half of that. The settlements ended up being as followed. Black parents were offered $400 for sons, and black wives were offered $600 for husbands, while white people were offered $800 for sons and $1,000 for husbands, almost double the amount. Also in 1936, the West Virginia Bureau of Mine Workers included silicosis as a diagnosis to cover workers. I'm sorry, not the West Virginia Bureau of Mine Workers, just the West Virginia Bureau of Workers, like workers' comp, basically. However, they had a stipulation that if you had to work more than 2 years in a facility to get it. And of course, this project only lasted 18 months, and only 2% even finished that. So even though just a few months they had contracted it, they couldn't get any compensation for it. So just another way to screw all the workers over. In 1936, the U.S. House of Representatives Labor Subcommittee began to hear hearings on the Hawks Nest disaster. Several workers, family members, doctors, journalists, and expert witnesses testified. The subcommittee ended up recommending full congressional hearings, but they never occurred. However, the report was read in the congressional record. It included findings that the company should have known of all the risks and should have acted upon them. They said there was an utter disregard for all approved methods of prevention of the inhalation of silica dust. Part of it reads as follows. This subcommittee finds that there was an utter disregard for all and any of the approved methods of prevention in the construction of the tunnel. That the whole driving of the tunnel was begun, continued, and completed with grave and inhumane disregard of all consideration for the health, lives, and future of the employees. This record presents a story of a condition that is hardly conceivable in a democratic government in the present century. It would be more representative of the Middle Ages. In the end, The U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Labor said Union Carbide completed the tunnels, like I said, with grave and inhumane disregard for all consideration that the health, lives, and future of the employees. Despite the conclusion of the House Committee, neither Reinhardt and Dennis nor Union Carbide would ever face legal consequences for the Hawks Nest disaster. Following the hearings, the House and Senate passed a joint resolution which empowered Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins to convene the first National Silicosis Conference in 1936. The conference resulted in many states including the disease in their workers' compensation laws. However, this was not always applied fairly due to differences defining the disease and a lack of proper way to enforce the law. Despite the company not being punished at the deaths of Hawks, it led to the passing of two important laws. The Walsh-Healey Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act were passed in 1937 and 1938, respectively. These laws improved safety standards in federal contracts and introduced labor protections such as national minimum wage and fair pay for the industrial workers. The health and safety standards were further strengthened in 1970 by the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which included guidelines for working with silica. So to recap, from March 1930 to December 1931 was the date of construction. 5,000 men worked there. Union Carbide only admitted that 109 workers died from it. They blamed the rest on pneumonia and tuberculosis, which of course are symptoms of silicosis. So they got the tuberculosis and pneumonia from the silica. But during the congressional hearings, they said that the Congress said at least 476 people died, and as many as 1,000 died within the next years. This was 20% of the workforce. Can you imagine working somewhere that the odds were 20% that you would die? I'm sure you wouldn't do it. I know I wouldn't. Unfortunately, these workers had no idea the death trap they were going into. And unfortunately, some of them still probably would have did it because they needed jobs and it was a depression. But I'm sure not everybody would have did it. Their deaths did contribute to major changes, but it all could have been prevented. So I mentioned the cemeteries earlier and how the deceased workers were put in mass graves or unmarked graves. They used an open field on Martha White's farm, wherever that is. This field became the burial grounds for many of the African Americans who died during the tunnel project. I got this from a website. It says, Owen Sims remembers the cemetery like this. He says, I used to rabbit hunt over there on the Martha White farm out in the fields before Route 19 came through here. I could see the graves. They were little soft mounds of dirt with grass over them. If you weren't careful, you could step on one and would cave in. They were in rows right up and down the fence line. They moved a lot of them when the highway came through, dug up the graves, and took what was left down by the Hughes Bridge on the Gauley River to bury them again. The gravesite laid almost forgotten until the Department of Highways decided to widen the Highway in 1972, which is what Owen Sims was talking about. This required that the graves be moved. The DOH moved the graves to a site close to Summersville Lake without much fanfare. It wasn't really given any thought by the public, sadly, but a lot of them probably didn't even know what happened there. It quickly became a spot for people to dump unwanted broken appliances and roadkill. It sat unmarked without caretakers for 40 years until a local couple, George and Charlotte Nealon, stepped up. In 2009, the couple prepared a grant application to fund a workers' memorial. Their first step was finding the site. This is where West Virginia State University professor Richard Hartman stepped in to study DOH maps and more clearly define the location. Once found, it took 3 years to clean up the site. Local high school students aided in the efforts, and soon the rest of the community began to contribute. A fence and steps were built, and applications were made for a historical marker for the long-forgotten memorial. On September 7, 2012, a dedication ceremony was held to recognize the miners and community's tireless restoration. So at least they finally got some recognition in 2012. It's just ridiculous. I never heard about this in school. I never learned about it, so I'm sure that most people didn't. I mean, I'm only probably like 100 miles away from this area. You'd think that we would hear about things like this in school. The tunnel and dam are still in use today. The tunnel was inspected in 2020, and they said it was in almost perfect condition, a testament to the workers that built it. After the tunnel disaster, Reinhardt and Dennis closed. I think they filed bankruptcy. I mentioned Union Carbide earlier in their disaster in Bhopal, India in the 80s. After that, they were several business mergers, and they're currently under a subsidiary of Dow Chemical. The tunnel's closed off. You can't even see it. I tried to look up pictures of it but it's just like looks like two doors in the side of a mountain. But you can visit the Hawks Nest Dam, and it's right there. And of course, the memorial and the cemetery you can visit. If you do decide to visit, there are a lot of other things to do there in Fayette County, West Virginia. Um, it's it's like a pretty active area in West Virginia. A lot of outdoors activities. The New River Gorge is right there. You can see the bridge that goes across the New River. It says this West Virginia website says Fayette County is located in the 63rd National Park, the New River Gorge National Park and Preserve. The area is home to renowned New River and the impressive New River Gorge Bridge, the longest single-span steel arch bridge in the Western Hemisphere. Finally, this is something I've actually been to. Surprise, surprise. Definitely worth checking out. Yearly, they have Bridge Day there, where people jump from the bridge with parachutes, obviously. There's also a bridge walk you can do walking under the bridge, which I think would be pretty cool. I used to know someone who worked there and led tours. Well, I think still know him, but I don't think he works there anymore. You can go whitewater rafting there, especially in the fall when they release some of the water to lower the water levels in the winter. If you're an outdoor lover, this is a perfect place to visit. Tons of hiking, beautiful trails, and all kinds of fun adventures. West Virginia is really a beautiful state, and this is one of the most beautiful parts of it. Thanks for listening. It's sad to see what corporations can do and get away with. That's why I'm bitter about corporations. This happened less than 100 years ago, so it's not that far from our time. And like I said, I've never heard of this until I started looking into Appalachian stuff. It's sad to think that many lives lost, and a lot of us don't even know about it. I made up a schedule, like I said, for the end of the year episodes I was going to cover. And I've completely changed my mind, so who knows what's coming up next. As always, I hope you'll take the journey with me. You can follow me on socials under Poison Appalachia. I'm on Facebook the most, but I'm also on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Threads. I was on X, but I deleted my profile on there. I'm not really too fond of that site. Also, you can email me at poisonappalachia@gmail.com. Or Facebook is probably the best two ways to contact me, especially Facebook. If you have any new show ideas you'd like me to cover, let me know. And I definitely look into that stuff. I have some good ideas coming up too, but I definitely would like to hear all of your opinions. Thanks, and bye, y'all.